My name is Amelia, and I am 31 years old. 5 weeks ago, my father stood at the port of Baltimore and calmly told my 76-year-old grandmother he forgot her ticket for our 3-week European family cruise. She had paid $35,000 out of her own retirement trust to fund the vacation. He handed her a $20 bill for a rideshare, turned his back, and walked up the gangway with 11 other family members. They planned to abandon her right there at the curb. I dropped my luggage on the concrete, shoved my way back through the boarding crowd, and stayed behind with her. What my father did not know was that over the next 5 weeks, I would trace every single forged document and empty bank account he used to save his failing real estate firm. Then the cruise ship returned to Maryland. My father walked out of the customs terminal tanned and smiling, expecting me to be standing there holding a pitiful local lawsuit. The color drained from his face when he saw the man standing right next to me, because that man was a federal agent holding a target letter that would end my father's career. Before we dive deep into this story, if you are new to the channel, please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Your support means so much more than you might imagine. And by the way, leave a comment letting me know your age, where you are watching this video from, and what time it is where you live right now. Welcome to Maya Tells Stories. I absolutely love reading those comments. Now, let me take you back to that humid August afternoon at the South Locust Point Terminal and the moment my father tore our family apart. The asphalt at the port radiated a thick heat that smelled of brackish water and diesel exhaust. It was the kind of Maryland afternoon where the humidity wraps around your throat the second you step out of the car. Towering above us was a 12-story transatlantic liner, its white hull glaring in the midday sun. My grandmother Beatrice stood near the curbside drop-off. Both of her hands gripped the handle of a floral canvas weekender bag. She wore a pressed navy blouse and practical walking shoes, dressed with the quiet dignity of a retired Anne Arundel County public school teacher preparing for a rare adventure. My father Thomas stood a few feet away. He checked the clasp on his stainless steel watch. He wore an untucked linen shirt and loafers, projecting the casual confidence of an Annapolis commercial real estate developer who always controlled the room. He slipped his phone into his pocket, turned to his mother, and exhaled. It was not a sigh of distress. It was the mild, inconvenienced sound of a man realizing a minor schedule change. "Look, Mom," Thomas said, his tone perfectly level. "The ship manifest kicked your suite reservation back. Total logistical hiccup on the cruise line end. They overbooked the upper decks." Beatrice blinked. The warm breeze caught a stray wisp of her gray hair. "Overbooked? But Thomas, the travel agent sent the confirmation packet last month. I saw the room number." "It is a glitch in their system," he interrupted, waving a hand to brush away her concern. "Patricia and I will hit the concierge desk the second we board and demand a refund. Just take an Uber back to the house for now. We will FaceTime you from Lisbon." He reached into his money clip, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and held it out to her. My mother, Patricia, stood right behind him. She adjusted her oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses and refused to look at Beatrice. Instead, she became hyper-focused on the leather luggage tags of her own designer suitcase. "We need to clear security, Tom," Patricia murmured, her voice tight and clipped. "The boarding window closes in 20 minutes. "Right," Thomas said. He patted Beatrice on the shoulder. 2 quick, hollow taps. He turned on his heel and gestured for my younger sister and cousins to follow. "Let us move, guys. Have a good week, Mom." They began walking toward the gangway. 11 people. Not one of them stopped to ask a question. Not one of them offered to stay behind. A cold static hummed behind my ears. I work as a regional compliance officer for a Maryland credit union. I monitor wire transfers and clear escrow accounts for a living. Cruise lines do not simply glitch a premium suite out of existence on the day of departure without an immediate reaccommodation protocol. My father was lying. The audacity of the departure paralyzed me for 3 seconds. Then, The panic set in. "Wait," I choked out. My voice cracked, betraying my attempt to sound authoritative. My younger sister Jessica was directly in front of me, dragging her rolling bag and complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her hair. I did not tap her shoulder. I did not ask her to move. I lunged forward, driving my shoulder into her arm hard enough to send her stumbling into a concrete security bollard. "Hey, what the hell, Amelia?" Jessica snapped, rubbing her elbow and glaring at me. I did not answer her. I dropped my own carry-on right there on the pavement. The heavy canvas slapped the concrete. I shoved my way back through the crowd of boarding tourists, ignoring their muttered complaints. I reached Beatrice just as a Port Authority worker blew a whistle to signal a moving forklift. I grabbed her wrist. Her skin felt paper-thin and damp with sweat. She was still holding the $20 bill Thomas had pressed into her palm, staring at the gangway where the back of his linen shirt was disappearing into the shadows of the terminal. "Amelia," Beatrice whispered. Her voice wavered, lacking its usual steady cadence. "Did I do something wrong with the paperwork?" "No, Graham," I said. My chest heaved as I pulled her weekender out of her grip. "You did not do anything wrong." Above us, the ship departure horn blasted. It was a low, bone-rattling vibration that echoed across the Patapsco River. My father was gone, my luggage was on the ground, and the reality of the long, silent drive back down Interstate 95 began to settle over us like a shroud. I looked at the crumpled cash in her hand, the math of my compliance training ticking rapidly in my head, forming a terrifying equation I was not yet ready to solve. We walked away from the terminal. I unlocked my Honda Civic. The interior was an oven. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, resting her purse on her lap. I merged onto Interstate 95 South, the tires thumping rhythmically against the concrete expansion joints. The air conditioning blasted, but the chill did nothing to dispel the thick, suffocating dread settling over the dashboard. I kept glancing at Beatrice in the rearview mirror, bracing myself for the tears. I expected her to break down, to ask why her own son would leave her standing on the curb. But she did not cry. She just turned her head and stared out the window at the heavy afternoon traffic bottlenecking near the Route 50 interchange toward Annapolis. Her silence was far more unnerving than a scream. It was the quiet, calculating stillness of a woman trying to process an impossible reality. My grandmother is not a fragile, helpless woman. She spent 30 years teaching middle school history in Anne Arundel County. She buried my grandfather a decade ago and learned to navigate the world on her own. But Thomas was her eldest. He was the golden son, the ambitious commercial real estate developer who took over the role of family patriarch when my grandfather passed. During the 2008 financial crash, Thomas had supposedly sacrificed a chunk of his own portfolio to keep our extended family afloat. It was a narrative he wore like a badge of honor, and Beatrice rewarded that perceived loyalty with unconditional trust. She raised him to be the protector, and today, that protector had handed her $20 and sailed away. We crawled through the stop-and-go traffic on Route 50. The brake lights glowed bright red in the summer haze. Neither of us turned on the radio. Every mile we drove away from Baltimore felt like crossing a threshold into a very dark room. I gripped the steering wheel, running through the compliance training protocols I used every day at the credit union. When a client's story does not match the paper trail, you follow the money. Thomas had cited a booking glitch, but $35,000 does not vanish into a glitch. We pulled into the driveway of her Annapolis home. It was a modest, sturdy brick house surrounded by blooming hydrangeas. Beatrice unbuckled her seatbelt with slow, deliberate movements. She told me she was going to brew some tea and walked up the front steps. I stayed behind to grab her weekender bag from the trunk. As I slammed the trunk shut, my eyes landed on the rusted metal mailbox standing near the curb. The red flag was up. I opened the squeaking metal door and pulled out a thick stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk: grocery store circulars, local landscaping advertisements, utility bills. But buried in the middle of the stack were 3 envelopes bearing the logo of a secondary regional bank. The return address was a wealth management division located in Bethesda. I flipped them over. Stamped across the front of the top 2 envelopes in bold red ink were the words, "Final Notice." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Beatrice received a comfortable pension from the Maryland public school system. Her house was paid off years ago. She had a healthy, revocable living trust that she drew from for major expenses, like transatlantic family vacations. There was no logical reason for her to receive a final notice from any financial institution, let alone 3 of them on the same day. I walked into the house. The air inside smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Beatrice was in the kitchen, filling a copper kettle at the sink. I set her bag down in the hallway, walked into the kitchen, and placed the stack of mail on the Formica counter. I separated the 3 bank letters and slid them toward her. "Graham," I said, keeping my voice steady, "why are you getting final notices from a wealth management branch?" She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on a dish towel and looked at the envelopes. A faint crease appeared between her eyebrows. She reached out and touched the red ink. "I am not sure, Amelia," she replied softly. "Thomas handles all the correspondence for that account. It holds the overflow from the main trust. He told me it was just a high-yield holding account." "He handles it?" I asked. "Do you not check the statements online?" Beatrice let out a weary breath and leaned against the counter. She looked older in the dim kitchen light than she had standing at the port. "They changed their system a few years ago," she explained. "They require that application on the phone, the one that sends the 6-digit security codes every time you try to log in. I could never get it to work right. I kept locking myself out. Thomas told me it was too much of a hassle for me to deal with. He set the authentication to go directly to his mobile device. He logs in, checks the balances, and gives me a verbal summary every month over Sunday dinner. He said it was easier that way." The kitchen went dead silent. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. I stared at the woman who had taught me how to read, realizing just how thoroughly she had been sidelined in her own life. 2-factor authentication is a standard banking security measure designed to protect the account holder. My father had weaponized it. By routing those security codes exclusively to his own phone, he had constructed an invisible fence around her life savings. He effectively stripped her of the ability to even view her own money without his direct permission and oversight. "You gave him sole digital access," I clarified, the dread pooling heavy in my chest. "You cannot log in without him?" "He is my son," Beatrice said, her chin lifting in a fleeting display of maternal defense. "I trust him to manage the technical things. He is a developer, Amelia. He deals with large sums of money every day. Why would I doubt him?" I picked up the top envelope. I did not ask for permission. I slid my finger under the paper flap and tore it open. I unfolded the notice. It was not a warning about a low balance. It was a formal alert regarding a series of insufficient funds penalties on a linked checking account. The account was overdrawn. I looked at the numbers printed on the page. The bottom line showed a negative balance. It made 0 cents. If she had just spent $35,000 on a cruise, the funds had to originate from somewhere. If this overflow account was empty, where did the cruise money come from? And more importantly, why had Thomas handed her a $20 bill instead of resolving a supposed ticketing error on site? He isolated her. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Thomas had not just made a mistake. He had systematically removed Beatrice from the financial equation, ensuring she was completely dependent on his narrative. If the money was gone, she would be the last person to find out. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I did not tell her about the negative balance. Not yet. I needed to see the full picture first, and I could not rely on my father to provide it. "Get your purse, Graham," I said. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter. "We are not drinking tea today. We are going to the local branch right now." Beatrice hesitated. She looked at the kettle, then at the final notice resting on the formica. "Amelia, what is going on?" "I do not know yet," I answered, opening the front door and letting the stifling August heat rush back into the hallway. "But we are going to find out." We walked back out to the Honda. The tension had shifted. It was no longer just a disappointing afternoon. It was the beginning of an investigation. But as I started the engine and reversed out of the driveway, I had no idea that the local bank branch was not going to provide the answers we needed. I had no idea that the very laws designed to protect my grandmother were about to be used as a weapon to keep the truth buried. We waited until Monday morning. The weekend had been an excruciating exercise in pretending everything was normal. Beatrice spent Sunday pruning her rose bushes and listening to the local radio station, refusing to discuss the empty overflow account or the fact that her eldest son was currently somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. I spent the weekend pacing the guest bedroom, running every worst-case scenario through my head. By the time Monday arrived, the Maryland summer heat had broken into a torrential morning downpour, turning the streets of Annapolis into slick, gray rivers. I drove us to the local bank branch on West Street. Beatrice wore a pressed linen skirt suit and her good pearl earrings. She dressed for the bank the same way her generation dressed for church, viewing financial institutions with a deep, inherent respect. She believed that bankers were pillars of the community, professionals who looked out for their neighbors. I knew better. In my line of work, I saw how easily bureaucratic red tape could be used to suffocate a victim. The interior of the branch was freezing, smelling of ozone and harsh citrus cleaning supplies. We were ushered into a glass-walled office belonging to the branch manager, a man named Mr. Caldwell. He wore a sharp, tailored suit and a polite, practiced expression. He offered us bottled water and settled behind his mahogany desk, intertwining his fingers. "How can we help you today, Mrs. Vance?" Caldwell asked, directing his attention entirely to my grandmother. I took the lead. "Beatrice is the grantor of a revocable living trust managed through your wealth division," I explained, keeping my tone professional and brisk. "We need physical printouts of the transaction history for the last 12 months. Specifically, we need to trace a $35,000 withdrawal made last week, as well as clarify the origin of 3 insufficient funds notices mailed to her residence." Caldwell nodded, his demeanor shifting into customer service mode. He typed her name into his computer. The clacking of the keyboard filled the quiet office. I watched his eyes scan the monitor. I saw the exact moment the polite customer service facade dissolved. His brow furrowed. He stopped typing, scrolled down, and then clicked his mouse twice to verify whatever he was seeing on the screen. He cleared his throat and adjusted his posture, suddenly looking very uncomfortable. "Mrs. Vance," Caldwell started, his voice dropping an octave, "I see the accounts in question. However, I am unable to print those statements for you today." Beatrice shifted in her leather chair. "I do not understand. That is my retirement money. My late husband and I opened that trust with this very branch 20 years ago." "I am aware," Caldwell replied, offering a tight, sympathetic smile. "But according to an amendment filed and processed 2 years ago, the operational structure of the trust was altered. Your son, Thomas Vance, was designated as the primary managing trustee with exclusive administrative authority over all daily transactions and record requests." The cold static returned to the base of my skull. "That is impossible," I countered, leaning forward. "It is a revocable living trust. She is the grantor. The grantor retains ultimate authority to view her own ledgers." "Usually, yes," Caldwell said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "But the specific language in this amendment delegates sole discretionary power to Thomas. It was filed along with a physician note indicating that Mrs. Vance requested him to assume total financial management for her own protection. It essentially places all disclosure rights behind his authorization. Without Thomas present, or without a direct court order compelling us to bypass our own privacy regulations, I am legally prohibited from handing you those records. My heart hammered against my ribs. A physician note. 2 years ago, Beatrice had fallen and required a hip replacement. She spent 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility on pain medication. Thomas had handled her discharge paperwork. He had framed it as an act of devotion, stepping up to take care of his ailing mother. Instead, he had used her temporary physical vulnerability to quietly execute a legal coup. He had built a fortress around her money, and he had used the bank-owned compliance rules as the mortar. "She is sitting right in front of you," I said, my voice rising. I felt a hot flush creeping up my neck. "Look at her. Does she look incapacitated to you? She is asking to see her own money." Caldwell held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I am not making a medical assessment. I am following strict federal banking privacy laws and internal liability protocols. If I hand over those documents without the primary trustee authorization, I am breaching fiduciary duty. Thomas Vance is a prominent commercial client of this institution. I cannot bypass his legal designation on a whim." "He is draining her accounts," I stated. The words tasted like copper. "He left her stranded at the port terminal on Saturday. He stole her vacation fund, and he is hiding the rest of it. You are shielding a thief." "Amelia," Beatrice whispered, reaching out to touch my forearm. Her hand was trembling. "Please, do not make a scene." I ignored her. The panic I had been suppressing all weekend suddenly boiled over. "I am a compliance officer," I snapped at Caldwell, my professional detachment shattering completely. "I know exactly how this works. You are using a fraudulent amendment to stonewall a vulnerable adult. You need to override the primary trustee designation right now and print those statements." "I cannot do that, Miss Vance." Caldwell stood up, his tone hardening. The polite banker vanished, replaced by a corporate liability shield. "I must ask you to lower your voice." I did not lower my voice. The thought of Thomas sipping champagne on the luxury liner while his mother received overdraft notices pushed me past the brink of rational thought. The fear for my grandmother morphed into a blinding, white-hot rage. "Print the statements," I shouted. I slammed both of my palms flat against the mahogany desk. The impact rattled a cup of pens and sent a jolt of pain up my wrists. "You are an accessory to elder exploitation. I will report this branch to the Federal Reserve. I will rip your charter apart. Print the damn papers." Caldwell did not flinch. He simply reached over and pressed a button on his telephone console. "Security to my office, please. We have a disruptive individual." "Amelia, stop it." Beatrice stood up. Her voice was sharp, carrying the undeniable authority of a former schoolteacher. I froze, the air leaving my lungs. I looked at my grandmother. She was not looking at the banker. She was looking at me, and her eyes were wide with profound humiliation. Her cheeks were flushed, dark red. She gathered her purse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the leather strap. She turned her back on me and walked out of the glass office before the security guard even arrived. The adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me hollow and nauseous. I had lost control. In my desperation to protect her, I had stripped away her dignity in the middle of a crowded bank lobby. A uniformed guard appeared in the doorway, resting a hand near his utility belt. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, "it is time for you to leave." I did not say another word to Caldwell. I grabbed my purse and walked out of the office. The entire lobby had gone quiet. Tellers and customers were staring at me. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, my face burning with shame, and walked out into the driving Maryland rain. Beatrice was already standing by the passenger door of my Civic, getting soaked. I unlocked the car, and we climbed inside. The windows immediately fogged up from our wet clothes. "I am so sorry, Graham," I whispered, staring blindly at the steering wheel. "I just wanted them to listen." She stared straight ahead through the rain-slicked windshield. Her jaw was set. "Thomas saved this family from ruin during the recession, Amelia. He paid your uncle mortgage. He kept your cousin in college. He is a good man who works in a high-pressure industry. There is a misunderstanding here, and we will sort it out when he gets home. We do not air our dirty laundry and scream at strangers." Her defense of him felt like a physical strike. Even now, facing closed accounts and locked doors, she clung to the narrative of the golden sun. She could not process the betrayal, because accepting it meant acknowledging that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, the windshield wipers swiping furiously against the glass. I realized in that cramped, damp car that brute force and righteous anger were not going to win this fight. Screaming at bankers only made me look like an unstable, greedy relative trying to bypass my father authority. If the bank would not give us the digital history because of a piece of paper, I had to find the paper itself. Thomas filed that amendment 2 years ago. The original documents had to exist somewhere outside the bank's servers, and I knew exactly where my grandmother stored 30 years' worth of family history. I drove us back from the bank in silence. The heavy rain washed the streets of Annapolis clean, but my mind remained a chaotic grid of locked doors and digital barriers. I had failed at the branch because I played by my father rules. I engaged in a frontal assault against an institution designed to repel emotion. The moment I slammed my hands on that mahogany desk, I stopped being a threat and became a security risk. I needed to stop acting like a panicked relative and start operating like the regional compliance officer I am. In my profession, when the digital trail is blocked, you revert to analog. Fraud always leaves a paper shadow. People who commit financial crimes are often meticulous, but arrogance breeds administrative blind spots. They secure the online banking portals, but forget about the physical filing cabinets hidden in plain sight. Beatrice kept 30 years of family history in the attic of her home. I waited until Tuesday morning when she went downstairs to the living room to watch her daytime television programs. I pulled down the creaking wooden stairs in the hallway ceiling and climbed up into the stifling heat. The Maryland summer humidity had seeped into the roof timbers, turning the cramped space into a sweltering wooden box. It smelled of dry rot, old mothballs, and decaying cardboard. I brought up a heavy-duty flashlight, a yellow legal pad, and a bottle of ice water. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I had to build an airtight case from the ground up, relying solely on primary source documents. For 3 consecutive days, I lived in that attic. I sat cross-legged on the rough plywood floorboards, surrounded by towering stacks of banker boxes. I sifted through the archaeological layers of my family financial existence. I worked with clinical determination, forcing my personal feelings into a tight compartment. My father was no longer my father. He was a subject of an audit. I built a chronological timeline on my legal pad. I found yellowed property deeds, faded municipal tax returns from the 1990s, and pristine folders containing my late grandfather life insurance policies. As I worked through the timelines, I saw the exact moment Thomas inserted himself into the narrative. After my grandfather passed, the signature lines on Beatrice documents shifted. Thomas began co-signing as a financial advisor. Then he appeared as an emergency proxy on medical forms. The escalation was gradual. It was painted as a devoted son taking the burden off a grieving widow. But viewing it all at once, spread across the dusty floor in the beam of a flashlight, the pattern was chilling. It was a slow, methodical enclosure of her independence. By Thursday afternoon, My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my lungs ached from the dust. The heat was dizzying. I was opening a water-damaged cardboard box tucked behind a broken floor lamp when I found it. A thick, green accordion folder labeled Estate Planning in my grandmother's elegant, cursive handwriting. I untied the string closure and spread the contents across the plywood. There was the original Revocable Living Trust, drafted 2 decades ago. The language was standard and transparent. Beatrice retained all discretionary power. But tucked behind the original contract was a rigid manila envelope containing copies of recent legal correspondence. My father had mailed Beatrice a duplicate of the trust amendment for her personal records. He likely assumed she would simply file it away without ever reading the dense legalese. He underestimated the meticulous nature of a retired public school teacher who kept a copy of everything she ever received. I pulled the heavy parchment out of the envelope and turned my flashlight onto the text. It was the exact amendment Caldwell cited at the bank. The document transferred sole managing authority to Thomas, stripping Beatrice of her digital access and disclosure rights. I scanned down to the final page, searching for the signature block. There was Beatrice's signature, but the ink looked stiff, lacking the fluid loops she always used when writing her name. It looked drawn rather than signed. Below her signature was the official state notary stamp, rendering the transfer of power legally binding. I checked the date stamped next to the notary seal. October 12th, 2 years ago. I stared at the date. I let my analytical training parse the timeline. October 12th. The numbers locked into place, triggering a sharp, chilling realization. 2 years ago, in mid-October, Beatrice fell on her front porch and shattered her hip. I remembered the timeline vividly because I had coordinated my work schedule to visit her. She underwent emergency hip replacement surgery on October 10th. On October 12th, she was heavily sedated on an intensive care recovery ward at Anne Arundel Medical Center. She was barely able to recognize her own visitors, let alone read and authorize a complex financial transfer. She could not have driven to a notary. A notary did not visit her hospital room. I was sitting in a chair next to her bed that entire afternoon. I brought the flashlight closer to the paper, illuminating the black ink of the official notary stamp. I read the name registered on the seal, Kevin Lawson. The stifling air in the attic seemed to evaporate. Kevin Lawson was not a random administrative clerk at a local shipping store. He was my father's business partner. They co-owned the commercial real estate development firm in downtown Annapolis. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Thomas had not just manipulated his mother, he had orchestrated a coordinated, multi-party fraud. He drafted the amendment while his mother was lying in a hospital bed, incapacitated by narcotics. He forged her signature. He walked the document into his own firm and had his business partner apply an official government seal to a fraudulent contract. He used that forged document to lock the bank accounts and siphon her money to fund his own lifestyle. It was not just a family dispute over a vacation fund anymore. It was a verifiable conspiracy to commit elder exploitation. I sat back on my heels, holding the flashlight steady on the forged signature. I finally had my leverage. I had the primary source evidence to shatter the corporate shield at the bank. I carefully slid the parchment back into the manila envelope and placed it inside my own leather tote bag. The clinical detachment I had maintained for 3 days gave way to a surge of grim satisfaction. I packed up my legal pad and turned off the flashlight. I was ready to climb down those creaking stairs and show my grandmother exactly who her golden son really was. But as I reached for the wooden ladder, my cell phone vibrated in my back pocket. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet isolation of the attic. I pulled the device out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message. The sender was my Aunt Patricia's sister, who was currently sitting somewhere on a luxury cruise liner in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I opened the message. expecting a taunting photo of a sunset or a cocktail. Instead, I read a block of text that made the blood freeze in my veins. My father had not just abandoned us at the port. He had spent the last 5 days building a narrative to ensure I could never expose him. The digital shadow of his retaliation was already arriving. And I was about to realize that the rest of my family was not just ignoring the truth. They were preparing to actively destroy me for trying to uncover it. I stood in the sweltering heat of the attic and stared at the glowing screen of my cell phone. The message was from my Aunt Susan. She was currently floating somewhere off the coast of the Azores on a luxury transatlantic liner. Maritime satellite internet packages are notoriously expensive, often costing hundreds of dollars for a basic connection. Susan did not purchase that package to check her work emails or post pictures of her ocean view balcony. She purchased it specifically to launch a preemptive strike across the Atlantic. I opened the message thread. The text was a solid block of words, devoid of any standard family greetings. It read, "We know exactly what you are doing, Amelia. Thomas warned us you might try to pull a stunt like this the moment we were out of the country. You are isolating your grandmother. You are taking advantage of her confusion to manipulate her estate. Step away from her financial documents immediately." I read the text twice, the meaning taking a few seconds to penetrate the shock. Thomas warned us. The phrase echoed in my mind. My father had not just improvised a lie at the port terminal. He had laid the groundwork for this smear campaign months in advance. He knew that the moment he abandoned Beatrice, I would start asking uncomfortable questions. To neutralize me, he had poisoned the well. He had painted a portrait of me for the rest of the family, framing me as the jealous, struggling millennial who resented her wealthy father. He likely spun a tragic narrative about my mental health, characterizing my analytical nature as paranoid delusions. A second message populated on my screen. This one hit harder than the first. Susan wrote, "I have already contacted a law firm in Annapolis. They are drafting an emergency protective order as we speak. You have no legal right to be in that house. If you do not leave the premises by tonight, we will have local law enforcement remove you for elder abuse and psychological endangerment. We are protecting Mom from you." The sheer projection of the accusation made my stomach churn. My father was the one who forged a notary seal to drain her retirement trust. My father was the one who left her standing on the concrete curb with a $20 bill. Yet, in the eyes of my mother, my sister, and my aunt, I was the villain. They chose to believe his fiction because the alternative required them to forfeit their luxury vacation and confront a devastating truth. Acknowledging his theft meant acknowledging their own complicity. They needed him to be the selfless provider, which meant they needed me to be the greedy, unstable daughter attempting a cash grab. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The heavy canvas of the accordion folder weighed down my tote bag, containing the forged amendment that proved my innocence. But physical evidence means nothing if you do not have the platform to present it. I climbed down the creaking wooden ladder and pushed it back into the ceiling, sealing the sweltering heat in the attic. I walked into the living room. The air conditioning was running, blowing a steady stream of floral upholstery. Beatrice sat in her favorite armchair. She was watching a daytime cooking program, sipping a glass of iced tea. She looked serene, entirely oblivious to the vicious legal war being waged over her life. I stood in the doorway, my hands gripping the straps of my tote bag. My first instinct was to pull out the forged document, drop it onto her lap, and demand she read the text message from Susan. I wanted to force her to see the ugly reality of her golden son and the family that enabled him. But my compliance training kicked in, overriding the urge for immediate vindication. If the family was already drafting legal paperwork claiming I was psychologically abusing her, confronting Beatrice with a shocking revelation right now was the worst possible tactical move. A sudden traumatic disclosure might trigger a medical event, or worse, she might panic and call Thomas for reassurance. If she contacted him, he would twist the narrative further, using her distress as proof of my supposed harassment. I was trapped in a catch-22. I had the weapon to defeat him, but drawing it now would only validate their smear campaign. I walked past the living room and went into the guest bedroom. I needed to assess the legal threat. I opened my laptop and searched for the Maryland statutes regarding emergency injunctions for vulnerable adults. The law is designed to act swiftly to protect the elderly from immediate harm. A concerned family member can petition the court for an ex parte order. If a judge grants it, the accused party is forced to vacate the property and cease all contact, often before they even have a chance to defend themselves in a hearing. Susan was not making an empty threat. She had the financial resources to hire a premium Annapolis law firm, funded by the very man who was robbing the victim. If they filed that petition, I would be legally barred from speaking to my grandmother. I would be locked out of the house, unable to intercept the bank notices or protect her from the next phase of his scheme. A quiet ping sounded from my laptop. I opened my email inbox. It was a preliminary communication from a recognized legal practice in downtown Annapolis. The subject line read, "Notice of Pending Action." Attached was a formal demand letter. It informed me that they represented the interests of the extended family and advised me to immediately cease all interference with the estate planning of Beatrice. The letter stated that a formal process server would deliver the binding court order within 48 hours if I did not voluntarily vacate the premises. The isolation settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I had no team. I had no backup. My mother had adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked the other way. My sister had shoved past me to get to the buffet line. My aunt was utilizing maritime satellites to threaten me with arrest. I was a regional credit union employee facing down a wealthy, unified front of people who shared my last name. I closed the laptop. The quiet of the guest bedroom offered no comfort. I looked out the window at my reliable, aging Honda Civic parked in the driveway. The reality of my own financial limitations brought a bitter taste to my mouth. Defending myself against a frivolous emergency injunction would require hiring my own defense attorney. A decent retainer in Anne Arundel County started at $5,000. I did not have $5,000 in disposable income. I barely had enough paid time off left at my job to cover the rest of the week. Thomas knew this. He knew my exact financial parameters. He designed this retaliatory strike knowing I lacked the capital to sustain a prolonged legal siege. He wanted to drain my resolve before the actual battle even began. I grabbed my car keys from the nightstand. I could not stay in that house a minute longer without suffocating under the weight of their collective betrayal. I told Beatrice I needed to run to the pharmacy to pick up a few things. I walked out the front door, the humid air hitting my face. I needed to sit in my car. I needed to think. But as I opened the driver door and slid into the sweltering interior, the sheer exhaustion of fighting my own blood finally breached my defenses, pushing me toward a breaking point I was not prepared to handle. I sat in the driver's seat of my Civic with the engine off. The Maryland afternoon heat quickly turned the small car into a suffocating glass box. The leather steering wheel burned against my palms. I stared through the windshield at my grandmother's neat brick house, watching a neighbor run a lawnmower down the adjacent sidewalk. The sheer normalcy of the suburban street felt mocking. Inside that house was a woman who had been robbed of $35,000. Out here in the driveway, I was holding a preliminary legal notice that threatened to criminalize my attempt to save her. I pulled my phone out and opened my banking application. I needed to face the exact reality of my financial limitations. The screen loaded, displaying a checking account balance that hovered just above $1,200. My savings account held roughly $3,000. I had spent $4,000 on my own non-refundable ticket for the European cruise, a vacation I had saved for over 2 years. That money was gone, vanished the moment I refused to board the ship. The retainer for a defense attorney to fight Susan's emergency injunction would cost a minimum of $5,000. I ran the numbers again and again, hoping a magical error would appear in my favor. The math remained stubbornly fixed. I was broke. My chest tightened, a familiar pre-panic response clawing its way up my throat. I am a regional compliance officer. I spend my days analyzing risk assessment models for a credit union. I am trained to remain objective, to separate emotion from data. But the data currently indicated that my own father had orchestrated a tactical strike designed specifically to bankrupt my resolve. He knew exactly what my salary was. He knew I had zero financial safety net. He deployed his sister and her expensive lawyers to crush me under the weight of legal fees I could never afford to pay. My phone vibrated in my hand. Another text message from Susan. I stared at the notification banner before opening the thread. The message read, "Amelia, Thomas wants to be reasonable about this. He knows you are upset about missing the trip. If you pack your bags and leave Mom House today, he will authorize a $5,000 transfer from his business account to cover your lost vacation expenses. Consider it a settlement. No lawyers, no injunctions. Just walk away and let him handle her estate like he always has." A settlement, a bribe. They were offering to replenish my lost savings if I simply turned a blind eye to the forged notary stamp sitting in my tote bag. If I walked away, the threat of the restraining order vanished. I could return to my quiet apartment in Baltimore, go back to my job, and pretend the drop-off at the port never happened. I would not have to fight my entire family. I would not have to face the terrifying prospect of legal ruin. The offer was a perfectly constructed exit ramp designed to appeal to my exhaustion. I dropped the phone into the passenger seat. The crushing weight of the isolation finally breached the levee I had maintained since Saturday. I did not deliver a stoic internal monologue about fighting for justice. I did not take a deep breath and formulate a brilliant counterattack. I snapped. A raw, guttural sob tore its way out of my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, the tears hot and fast, blurring my vision. The frustration, the betrayal, and the sheer terror of fighting a wealthy adversary morphed into a violent physical need to release the pressure. I slammed my fist into the steering wheel. The horn blared, a sharp, ugly sound that startled the neighbor across the street. I did not care. I hit the wheel again. My knuckles struck the hard plastic casing, the impact sending a dull ache up my forearm. I hit it a third time, sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for air in the stifling heat of the car. I hated them. I hated my mother for looking away. I hated my sister for complaining about her hair while our grandmother stood abandoned on the curb. Most of all, I hated my father. I hated him for his casual cruelty, for the way he used his wealth as a bludgeon to force compliance. I hated him for making me choose between my own financial survival and the safety of the woman who taught me how to read. I leaned my forehead against the hot steering wheel, my chest heaving. The bruising on my knuckles throbbed. I let the tears fall, granting myself permission to feel the absolute, messy despair of the situation. The settlement offer sat on the passenger seat, glowing on the screen of my phone. $5,000. Freedom from the looming lawsuit. A return to the quiet, predictable life I had built for myself. It was the logical choice. It was the compliance-approved path of least resistance. But as my breathing slowed and the immediate wave of panic receded, a cold, hard truth began to crystallize in the sweltering air of the Civic. If I took that money, I became an accomplice. Accepting his bribe meant participating in the exploitation. If I walked away, Thomas would drain the rest of Beatrice Revocable Living Trust. When the money finally ran out, he would likely sell this brick house right out from under her to cover his commercial real estate debts. She would eventually discover the theft, and she would realize that the granddaughter who stayed behind at the port had ultimately abandoned her too, bought off for the price of a cheap settlement. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The skin around my eyes felt tight and salty. I picked up my phone. I did not type a witty, defiant response to Susan. I did not engage in a digital screaming match. I swiped left on the message thread and hit delete. I navigated to my settings and blocked her number, severing the transatlantic communication line. I blocked my mother. I blocked my sister. I systematically cut the digital tethers connecting me to the people actively trying to destroy me. I looked down at my bruised knuckles. The pain was grounding. It was a sharp, physical reminder that the theoretical phase of this conflict was over. I could not afford a defense attorney to fight a prolonged civil war over an emergency injunction. I could not rely on the local bank branch to bypass their privacy regulations. I had to change the venue of the battlefield. If they wanted to use the local courts to paint me as an elder abuser, I had to secure the victim testimony before the process server arrived with the restraining order. I opened the car door and stepped back out into the humid Maryland afternoon. I did not go to the pharmacy. I walked back up the driveway and unlocked the front door. The cool air conditioning hit my flushed face. Beatrice was still sitting in her floral armchair, the television volume low. She looked up and smiled, oblivious to the fact that I had just declared war on her favorite child. I walked into the living room and muted the television. I pulled the heavy accordion folder out of my tote bag. The time for careful maneuvering was over. I had to show her the forged notary stamp. I had to make her read the fake amendment that stripped her of her autonomy. I had to force her to choose between the son who stole from her and the granddaughter trying to save her. But confronting a mother with the undeniable proof of her son's criminality is not a straightforward equation. I was about to ask her to participate in his destruction, and I had severely miscalculated the depth of her protective instinct. I stood in the center of my grandmother's living room. The television screen flashed bright colors from a daytime cooking show, but the room was silent. I had muted the volume. Beatrice sat in her floral armchair holding a glass of iced tea. She looked at me with mild curiosity, unaware that the heavy canvas folder in my hands contained the destruction of her reality. I did not want to do this. I wanted to protect her from the ugly truth of her own family, but my father and my aunt had forced my hand. I stepped forward and cleared the magazines off the mahogany coffee table. I untied the string of the accordion folder and pulled out the rigid manila envelope. I drew a slow breath, grounding myself in the analytical detachment of my compliance training. I placed the original revocable living trust on the table. Then, I laid the fraudulent amendment right next to it. "Graham," I said, keeping my voice soft and measured, "I need you to look at these pages. I need you to read the signature line." Beatrice set her iced tea on a coaster. She reached into her pocket, retrieved her reading glasses, and slipped them onto the bridge of her nose. She leaned forward, the fabric of her blouse rustling in the quiet room. She looked at the first document. She recognized it instantly. It was the trust she and my grandfather had drafted decades ago. Then she shifted her gaze to the second document. I watched her eyes scan the dense legal paragraphs. I watched her read the clauses designating Thomas as the sole managing trustee. She reached the final page. Her index finger hovered over the ink of her own name. "I did not sign this," Beatrice whispered. "The ink is wrong. The loops are too stiff." "I know you did not sign it," I replied. I knelt down next to the coffee table, bringing myself to her eye level. "Look at the date, stamped right below your name, next to the notary seal." She squinted at the black ink. October 12th, 2 years ago. "Do you remember where you were on October 12th, 2 years ago?" I asked gently. She thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. "I was in the hospital. I had my hip replacement on the 10th. I was in the intensive care recovery ward for 3 days. I was on heavy pain medication. I barely remember that week. I nodded. You were in a hospital bed at Anne Arundel Medical Center. You could not walk. You could not drive. And a notary public certainly did not visit your recovery room. I was sitting in the chair next to your bed that entire afternoon. I pointed to the circular notary seal stamped onto the parchment. The name registered on that stamp is Kevin Lawson. He is Thomas' business partner at the commercial real estate firm in downtown Annapolis. The air in the living room grew heavy. I did not need to explain the mechanics of the crime. Beatrice was a sharp, educated woman. She connected the dots with devastating speed. Thomas had drafted the amendment while she was incapacitated. He had forged her signature. He had taken the paperwork into his own office and had his partner apply a state government seal to a fraudulent contract. He used that document to lock her out of her own bank accounts and siphon her retirement funds to cover his business debts. I expected her to express outrage. I expected her to demand justice or ask for the phone to call the authorities. Instead, I witnessed something far more painful. I watched a mother heartbreak in real time. Beatrice did not cry. Her shoulders slumped, shedding years of proud, independent posture in a matter of seconds. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin looking fragile and translucent. She took off her reading glasses and folded them with trembling fingers. She stared at the forged signature, tracing the stiff letters of her name without actually touching the paper. The quiet heartbreak radiating from her was a physical weight in the room. We have to go to the Annapolis police, I told her, keeping my tone encouraging. We have the primary source evidence. We have the timeline. We can file a report for forgery and elder exploitation. If we file the criminal report today, the police can intercept the emergency injunction Susan is trying to serve me. We can freeze Thomas' accounts before he drains the rest of the trust. Beatrice slowly shook her head. Her gaze remained fixed on the coffee table. No, she said. The word was faint, but it carried a finality that made my stomach drop. Graham, you have to, I urged, shifting closer. He stole $35,000 for a vacation he never intended to take you on. He left you on the curb. He is threatening to have me arrested to cover his tracks. You are the victim here. You have to tell the police. Beatrice finally looked at me. Her eyes were dry, but they held a profound, tired sorrow. Amelia, you were in high school in 2008. You do not know how bad things got. The housing market crashed. Your uncle lost his job and faced foreclosure. Your cousin was about to drop out of college because the tuition money dried up. Thomas stepped in. He bled his own accounts dry. He took on terrible loans to keep this family afloat. He saved this house. He saved your uncle. He carried the weight of everyone's failures, and he never complained. She picked up her iced tea, her hands shaking so badly the ice cubes clinked against the glass. He is a proud man, she continued, her voice trembling. He built his real estate firm from nothing. He is drowning in debt right now, and his pride will not let him admit he failed. He convinced himself he is just borrowing this money. He convinced himself he will put it back when he closes his next deal. He is wrong. He committed a terrible crime. But he is still my son. I stared at her, the realization settling over me like a suffocating blanket. She was not denying the theft. She was acknowledging the betrayal, accepting the reality of the forged documents, and choosing to protect the thief anyway. She understood the depth of his desperation. She saw the frightened, drowning man. I cannot sit in a courtroom and testify against him, Beatrice whispered. I cannot watch local police officers put my eldest child in handcuffs and lock him in a local jail cell. I will not be the one to destroy his life. I just want my digital access back. I want to talk to him when he comes home. We will handle this within the family. The frustration flared in my chest, hot and urgent. Handling it within the family meant I would be thrown to the wolves. Susan lawyers were already drafting the paperwork to have me removed from the property. If Beatrice refused to go to the local authorities, my entire defense strategy evaporated. In the state of Maryland, prosecuting intra-family elder financial abuse is notoriously difficult, even with a cooperative victim. Without the victim willingness to press charges or testify, local detectives will classify the issue as a civil family dispute and close the file. The local police would not intervene. A local civil suit was dead in the water before it even began. I stood up. My knees ached from kneeling on the hardwood floor. I looked down at the forged document resting on the table. The compliance officer inside my head began to run new calculations. My father had weaponized the local banking privacy laws. He had weaponized the local family court system through his sister. And now, he had weaponized his own mother grief to shield himself from local criminal prosecution. I could not use the Annapolis police. I could not use the local family courts. If I tried to force the issue here, Beatrice would retreat into denial and I would be exiled by a court order. I had to pivot. I had to find a different angle that did not rely on local law enforcement or the cooperation of a heartbroken mother. I had to look past the emotional betrayal and focus entirely on the mechanics of the crime itself. Thomas had stolen $35,000. He had likely stolen much more to cover his failing commercial real estate firm. Money of that magnitude does not simply vanish. It moves. It leaves a digital footprint across routing numbers, wire transfers, and municipal tax declarations. I needed to trace the exact path of the stolen funds. If I could map the architecture of his fraud, I might discover a vulnerability he had not anticipated. I needed to follow the wires, and I needed to do it before the process server knocked on the front door. I carefully gathered the original trust and the forged amendment from the coffee table, slipping them back into the manila envelope. I told Beatrice I was going to make lunch. I walked into the kitchen, the heavy canvas folder under my arm. The local avenues were closed, but the financial system is vast and unforgiving. I just needed to find the right door to knock on. I walked into the kitchen and set the heavy canvas folder on the Formica counter. The emotional weight of my grandmother's decision hung in the humid air of the house, but I could not afford to drown in it. If Beatrice refused to testify, the local avenues of justice were barricaded. A county detective would look at the forged notary stamp, look at the reluctant victim, and toss the file into a drawer labeled Civil Dispute. My Aunt Susan was already weaponizing the local family courts against me. I needed a battleground where their localized influence meant nothing. I opened my laptop and connected to the wireless internet. The bright screen illuminated the dim kitchen. I spread the 3 final notice envelopes across the table. My compliance training provided a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Money is never invisible. People think they can hide stolen funds by shuffling cash between ledgers, but every transaction leaves a digital wake. My father was a commercial real estate developer, not a cybersecurity ghost. He operated in a world of tangible assets, which meant he had to park the stolen capital somewhere the physical economy could register it. I stared at the insufficient funds notices. The overdraft penalties were triggered by automated outbound transfers, attempting to pull from a drained account. I read the fine print on the second page of the statement. The receiving entity was listed under a truncated alphanumeric code, but the transaction description contained a partial name, Severn Edge Holdings, LLC. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation database. It is a public registry that tracks every corporate entity operating within the state. I typed Severn Edge Holdings into the search bar and hit enter. The spinning loading icon felt agonizingly slow. Then, the corporate profile populated on my screen. The limited liability company was formed 18 months ago. The principal address was listed as a post office box in a strip mall just outside of downtown Annapolis. But the resident agent, the person legally designated to receive official correspondence for the business, caught my immediate attention. The name listed was Kevin Lawson. the very same corrupt business partner who had applied his government notary seal to the forged trust amendment. My pulse quickened, a steady rhythm thumping in my ears. Thomas had not just transferred the money into his personal checking account. He had created a corporate vehicle specifically designed to catch the stolen funds. He was layering the theft to obscure the origin of the capital. I needed to see the scale of the operation. To do that, I had to leave the state business registry and dive into the Anne Arundel County public land records. Real estate developers buy properties using leverage. They secure commercial loans by putting up cash collateral. If Thomas was funneling his mother retirement money into a shell company, he was doing it to satisfy a bank. I searched the county land records for any recent commercial acquisitions tied to my father primary development firm. The database returned a dense list of deeds, liens, and zoning permits. I scrolled through the legalese, my eyes burning from the bright monitor. My hand cramped around the computer mouse, the muscles tight and aching from hours of tense navigation. I ignored the physical discomfort, clicking rapidly through pages of scanned property filings. Then I found the anchor. 6 months ago, Thomas purchased a distressed commercial retail block on West Street. It was an ambitious, over-leveraged gamble. The financing documents revealed a complex web of corporate debt. To secure the primary commercial mortgage from a national lender, Thomas was required to provide a significant cash down payment to collateralize the loan. I opened the deed of trust attached to the West Street property. I read the guarantor disclosures. Right there, buried in the middle of the third paragraph, was Severn Edge Holdings, LLC. The shell company was listed as a secondary financial guarantor, pledging liquid capital to secure the commercial mortgage. I grabbed my yellow legal pad and a pen. I started writing down the dates and the dollar amounts listed in the public filings. I cross-referenced them with the dates on Beatrice overdraft notices. The math assembled itself with a cold, terrifying logic. 18 months ago, Thomas formed the Shell Company. Over the next year, he systematically drained $120,000 from Beatrice Overflow Trust account, transferring the funds into the LLC in staggered increments to avoid triggering automated fraud alerts. He used that stolen $120,000 to collateralize the commercial loan for the West Street retail block. But commercial real estate is volatile. Construction delays and rising interest rates likely triggered a margin call from his lenders. Thomas suddenly needed more liquid cash to keep the loan from defaulting. He required a rapid injection of capital. He turned to the only source he had left. He drained the final $35,000 from Beatrice Primary Vacation Fund, wiring it directly to the shell company to satisfy the bank. He used the European cruise as a convenient cover story, knowing the family would be out of the country for 3 weeks, buying him the exact amount of time he needed for the wire transfers to clear the international banking systems. I stared at the handwritten numbers on my legal pad. $155,000. The sheer scale of the deception made the breath catch in my throat. I pushed my chair back from the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly. I rubbed my temples, trying to ward off a sudden, sharp headache. He did not just steal a vacation. He decimated a lifetime of hard work to prop up his own failing ego. A sick feeling washed over me. I stood up and paced the length of the kitchen. Thomas had convinced himself he was a financial savior, a businessman navigating a tough market. He justified the theft by telling himself he would pay Beatrice back once the retail block generated a profit. But the mechanics of his survival were inherently criminal. He had committed elder exploitation, which was a local issue, but by moving those stolen funds through a corporate shell company to secure a loan from a national bank, he had escalated his crimes. He engaged in interstate wire fraud. He submitted falsified asset declarations to a financial institution, which constituted federal bank fraud. And by hiding the origin of the stolen money to benefit his commercial enterprise, he crossed the threshold into money laundering. The local police in Annapolis might dismiss a forged document as a messy family inheritance dispute. A county judge might grant my aunt her emergency injunction, forcing me out of the house and silencing my concerns. But the federal government views the illegal collateralization of commercial loans through an entirely different lens. I stopped pacing. I looked at the thick canvas folder resting next to my laptop. I did not need Beatrice to sit in a county courtroom and testify against her son. I did not need to fight a localized civil war against my aunt's expensive defense attorneys. I had the routing numbers. I had the forged notary timeline. I had the public property deeds connecting the stolen funds directly to the Shell LLC. I had mapped the exact architecture of a federal financial crime. The crushing exhaustion that had paralyzed me in the driveway evaporated, replaced by a sharp, dangerous adrenaline. Thomas thought he had boxed me into a corner. He thought his preemptive legal strikes would force me to accept his $5,000 bribe and walk away. He believed the battle would be fought on his home turf, where his wealth and social standing insulated him from consequences. He was wrong. The battlefield was about to expand far beyond the jurisdiction of Anne Arundel County. I walked back to the kitchen table, closed my laptop, and packed my legal pad into my tote bag. I knew exactly who possessed the authority to tear down the walls my father had built. I just had to be willing to initiate a strike that would reduce his entire commercial empire to ashes. The kitchen table was covered in printed property records and bank notices. I sat in the quiet house, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. The local avenues of justice were firmly closed. My grandmother refused to testify against her son, and my aunt was actively mobilizing an expensive legal team to have me thrown out of the house. If I stayed in Anne Arundel County and tried to fight them on their terms, I would be crushed by their financial resources and their local social connections. But the documents scattered in front of me offered a different path. Thomas had not just stolen money from a trusting family member. He had manipulated the national banking system. When you wire large sums of money between financial institutions, those transactions cross state lines and utilize federal networks. By moving $35,000 from the overflow account to his shell company, Thomas committed wire fraud. But the vulnerability that would truly dismantle him was hidden deep within the tax code. A revocable living trust generates taxable yields. The Internal Revenue Service requires the managing trustee to accurately report those yields and all related distributions. By siphoning $120,000 into a corporate entity to collateralize a commercial loan, Thomas had hidden taxable assets. The federal government considers embezzled funds to be taxable income. The origin of the money does not matter to the government as long as they get their share. Thomas had falsified his tax declarations to conceal the theft. He committed tax evasion. This was the calculated risk I had to take. The federal authorities do not require a heartbroken mother to sit on a witness stand and point a finger at her child. The government does not care about family loyalty, and they certainly do not care about a local family court injunction drafted by my aunt. If I could prove the tax evasion and the wire fraud, the federal agents would become the victim on behalf of the United States Treasury. They would prosecute him regardless of what Beatrice wanted. It was a terrifying realization. Bringing down the full weight of a federal agency on my own father was a permanent decision. I remembered him paying for my college textbooks. I remembered him helping me move into my first apartment. I balanced those memories against the image of him handing his mother a $20 bill and leaving her on the concrete curb. The choice was agonizing, but the math was clear. I drove to an office supply store early the next morning. I needed to build a presentation that would cut through the bureaucratic noise of a busy federal agency. I bought a thick 3-ring binder, plastic sheet protectors, and packs of colored index tabs. I returned to the guest bedroom and turned the small desk into a workspace. I drew upon every compliance audit I had ever conducted for the credit union. Law enforcement officers are incredibly busy people. If you hand them a messy stack of loose papers and a chaotic, emotional story, they will show you the door. You have to hand them a completed puzzle. I spent 12 hours assembling the binder. I placed the original trust document and the fraudulent amendment in the first section. I used a bright yellow marker to highlight the forged signature and the corrupt notary stamp. The second section contained the medical records, proving Beatrice was hospitalized and incapacitated on the exact day the amendment was executed. The third section detailed the banking path. I included the overdraft notices and mapped the exact timeline of the missing $155,000. The final section was the kill shot. I inserted the Anne Arundel County public land records, the commercial loan documents, and the state registration for the shell company. I drew a direct, undeniable line from the stolen trust funds to the cash collateral used for his West Street retail development. I held the completed binder in my hands. The heavy plastic felt cold against my skin. It contained the total ruin of a prominent Annapolis businessman. If you found out a family member committed a federal crime, would you report them, or would blood keep you quiet? Drop your answer below. I did not call the Annapolis Police Department. I bypassed the local authorities entirely. The risk of a county detective recognizing my father's name or tipping off his high-priced defense attorney was simply too great. Instead, I searched online for the regional headquarters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Most people associate federal financial crimes with the FBI, but compliance officers know the truth. The IRS Criminal Investigation Unit is the most lethal financial law enforcement agency in the country. They follow the paper trail with ruthless precision. I found the contact information for the Baltimore field office. I dialed the number, swallowing hard to clear my dry throat. A duty officer answered the line. I did not sound like a frantic, grieving daughter. I kept my voice flat and professional. I introduced myself as a regional credit union compliance officer. I stated that I had compiled primary source documentation of a multi-year wire fraud and tax evasion scheme involving a commercial real estate developer and a corrupt notary public. The specific use of financial terminology acted as a key. The duty officer transferred me to an intake supervisor. I requested an in-person meeting to hand over the evidence. The supervisor agreed to see me the following morning. The next day dawned gray and overcast. I dressed in my most conservative business suit, pulling my hair back into a tight clasp. I left Beatrice eating breakfast in the kitchen, telling her I had to attend a mandatory training seminar for work. I walked out to my car, constantly scanning the quiet suburban street for an unfamiliar vehicle. My aunt process server could arrive at any moment with the emergency injunction to force me off the property. The clock was running out on my local sanctuary. I drove north on Interstate 95 toward Baltimore. The morning traffic was dense, but I maneuvered through the lanes with a singular focus. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Every mile brought me closer to a point of no return. I navigated the congested downtown grid and found a parking garage near the George H. Fallon Federal Building. The Federal Building was an imposing structure of glass and steel, projecting an aura of cold, untouchable authority. I walked through the sliding front doors and entered the security screening area. Uniformed guards instructed me to place my belongings on the conveyor belt. I set the heavy binder and my purse into the plastic bin. I walked through the metal detector. The machine remained silent, but my heart pounded against my ribs with a deafening rhythm. I gathered my things and walked toward the elevators. The marble floors echoed with the sharp clicks of my shoes. I rode the elevator to the designated floor, the numbers blinking above the door as I ascended. I stepped out into a quiet, sterile hallway lined with secure doors. I found the suite number for the Criminal Investigation Division and pressed the intercom buzzer. The lock clicked open. I stepped into the intake lobby, holding the physical proof of my father's deception tight against my chest. I had successfully bypassed my family retaliatory strikes and delivered the evidence to the threshold of the federal government. But as I took a seat in the waiting area, I realized that getting through the front door was only the first step. I still had to convince a seasoned federal agent that a local commercial developer was worth their time. And the man I was about to meet had a reputation for dismissing cases that did not meet his exacting standards. The intake lobby of the Criminal Investigation Division was unnervingly quiet. There were no ringing telephones or bustling clerks. The space felt like a vault designed to intimidate anyone who crossed its threshold. I sat on a rigid leather chair, the heavy plastic binder resting on my knees. I focused on the steady hum of the overhead air conditioning to keep my breathing even. 10 minutes passed. Then a heavy security door clicked, unlocked, and swung open. A man stepped into the lobby. He did not wear a tactical jacket or a tailored designer suit. He wore dark slacks, a modest gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and a plain tie loosened at the collar. He looked like an exhausted accountant who had been staring at spreadsheets since dawn. But the gold shield clipped to his belt and the holstered firearm resting on his hip projected an entirely different authority. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried a faint Baltimore edge. "I am Special Agent Elias Thorne. You told the intake supervisor you have evidence of a multi-party wire fraud scheme. Follow me." I stood up, gripping the binder, and followed him through the security door. We walked down a long corridor illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. We entered a small, windowless interview room containing a single metal table and 3 chairs. Thorne gestured for me to sit. He took the seat across from me, placing a blank legal pad and a pen on the table. He did not offer small talk. He looked at me with a tired, clinical gaze that made me feel like I was already on a witness stand. "Walk me through it," Thorne instructed, uncapping his pen. "Keep it to the mechanics." I opened my mouth, intending to deliver the polished, analytical summary I had rehearsed in the car. Instead, the sheer exhaustion of the past few days caught up with me. I started talking about the cruise ship. I talked about the $20 bill my father handed my grandmother. I mentioned my aunt texting me from the middle of the ocean, threatening to throw me out of the house. My voice wavered. My hands trembled as I tried to unclip the front of the binder, my fingers slipping on the plastic rings. I was rambling, my professional composure dissolving under the intense scrutiny of a federal agent. Thorne held up his hand. The gesture was simple, but commanded instant silence. He set his pen down. "Miss Vance, let me stop you right there," Thorne said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "I hear stories like this 3 times a week. A wealthy parent ages, the siblings start fighting over the estate, and suddenly everyone is accusing everyone else of theft. You are describing a domestic inheritance dispute. Your father took his mother money. That is a terrible thing, but it is a state issue. You need to take this to the local civil courts or the county police. The Internal Revenue Service does not referee family drama. I have limited resources and I use them to hunt organized tax evasion." His logic was sound. From his perspective, I was just a scorned daughter trying to use a federal agency to settle a personal score. The rejection stung, sharp and cold. I felt the familiar heat of panic rising in my throat. I had risked everything to walk into this building. I had bypassed the local authorities based on a high-stakes gamble. If Thorne walked out of this room, I had nothing left. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I forced myself to swallow the panic. I was not a grieving granddaughter right now. I was a compliance officer, and I needed to speak his language. I pushed the binder across the metal table. "I understand your jurisdiction, Agent Thorne," I said, my voice steadying into a flat, professional cadence. "I am not asking you to referee my family. I am asking you to look at Section 4. Thorne looked at the binder, then back at me. He did not move to open it. "My father is a commercial real estate developer in Annapolis," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "He did not just take the money. He forged a state notary seal to alter a revocable living trust while the grantor was hospitalized on narcotics. He used that forged authority to wire $155,000 across state lines. He parked that stolen capital in a shell company called Severn Edge Holdings, LLC. Thorne raised an eyebrow, the skepticism shifting just a fraction. He used that shell company to illegally collateralize a commercial loan for a retail development on West Street, I stated, tapping the plastic cover of the binder. Embezzled funds are taxable income. He falsified his declarations to conceal the origin of the capital, defrauding both a national lender and the United States Treasury. I have the routing numbers. I have the hospital records proving the forgery. I have the county land deeds tying the shell company to the commercial mortgage. I built the paper trail. You just have to follow it. The room grew very quiet. Thorne stared at me, evaluating the weight of my claims. He reached out and opened the binder. He bypassed the first 3 sections and flipped directly to the colored tab marking Section 4. I sat frozen while he read. The silence stretched for agonizing minutes. I watched his eyes scan the printed property deeds. I watched him trace the flow of the routing numbers I had mapped out on the spreadsheet. He flipped back to the forged notary stamp, comparing the date to the attached hospital admission records. His posture slowly transformed. The weary, dismissive accountant vanished. The federal investigator took over. Thorne closed the binder. He rested his hands on top of the plastic cover. He looked at me, and the clinical detachment in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. Your documentation is thorough, Thorne admitted, his voice dropping to a quieter register. You did the heavy lifting on the paper trail. But you need to understand how this building operates. Federal financial investigations are not swift. We do not kick down doors based on a spreadsheet. We build grand jury indictments, and that process usually takes 12 to 18 months. We move slow by design to ensure the charges stick. My heart sank. 12 to 18 months. I did not have 18 months. I barely had 18 hours. My aunt process server was likely circling my grandmother neighborhood right now. The European cruise ended in 10 days. Once my father returned to Maryland and realized I was digging into his ledgers, he would destroy the remaining evidence and hide behind his expensive lawyers. I do not have that kind of time, I said, the desperation leaking back into my voice. He gets off a ship in less than 2 weeks. My aunt is filing an emergency injunction to remove me from the house today. If I lose access to my grandmother, he wins. He will bleed her dry before you even impanel a jury. Thorne picked up his pen. He tapped the end of it against the metal table, a rhythmic, thoughtful sound. Under normal circumstances, you would be out of luck, Thorne replied, but your father made a severe tactical error. He got greedy in the wrong neighborhood. I frowned, confused by the shift in his tone. What do you mean? Thorne opened the binder again and pointed to the commercial loan documents attached to the West Street property. He pointed directly to the name of the national lender Thomas had used to secure his mortgage. Post-pandemic commercial real estate is a mess, Thorne explained, leaning in closer. We are currently running a joint task force auditing a string of over-leveraged developers in the Annapolis and Baltimore sectors. The lender your father used is already under a microscope for turning a blind eye to shady cash collateral. We have been monitoring the West Street Development Syndicate for 3 months, trying to find a weak link in their financing. A surge of apprehensive hope sparked in my chest. You are already investigating his project. We are investigating the network, Thorne corrected. But your father just handed us the keys to the front door. By tying a verifiable federal wire fraud scheme directly to that specific commercial loan, he inadvertently dragged his personal theft into an active federal audit. Because the infrastructure of our investigation is already in place, the timeline shrinks. We do not need 18 months. We can move on this right now. The relief was so profound, it made me lightheaded. I had found the right door. I had handed the federal government the exact piece of ammunition they needed for a larger war. But there is a catch, Thorne warned, breaking my momentary relief. To fast-track a target letter and freeze his assets before that cruise ship docks, we need a cooperating witness on the inside. Paper trails are great, but prosecutors love confessions. We need the man who stamped that forged document. We need Kevin Lawson. Thorne closed the binder and stood up. If I issue a federal subpoena to Lawson today, we have to hope he is willing to flip on his business partner to save himself. If Lawson holds the line and calls a lawyer, this whole thing stalls. And while we wait for him to crack, you still have a process server hunting you down with a local eviction order. He walked toward the door, holding my binder under his arm. I will get the subpoena drafted, Miss Vance. You need to go home and figure out how to survive the next few days. Because the moment I serve his partner, your father is going to feel the shockwave from the middle of the ocean. And cornered men do terrible things. I drove back to Annapolis feeling like I was suspended in midair. I had handed a detonator to Agent Thorne, but the explosion was entirely out of my control. The success of the federal intervention hinged completely on the nerve of a corrupt notary public. Kevin Lawson was not a hardened criminal. He was a commercial real estate agent who liked playing golf and signing paperwork. If Thorne could terrify him into cooperating, the federal machine would dismantle my father. If Lawson lawyered up and kept his mouth shut, the investigation would stall, and I would be left defenseless against my aunt's retaliatory strike. I returned to Beatrice's house and parked my Civic in the driveway. The Maryland afternoon was thick with humidity, the air stagnant and heavy. I walked through the front door, half expecting to find a process server waiting in the living room. But the house was quiet. Beatrice was in the kitchen, meticulously peeling a cucumber over the sink. I did not tell her where I had been. I simply told her my training seminar ran long and retreated to the guest bedroom to wait. The next 48 hours were agonizing. I checked my phone every 10 minutes, jumping at every unverified email notification and automated calendar reminder. I jumped at the sound of the mail carrier dropping letters into the metal box outside. I lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the federal shoe to drop. On Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks into the European cruise, the silence finally broke. My cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. The caller ID displayed an unknown number with a Baltimore area code. I answered the call, my chest tight with anticipation. "Miss Vance?" Agent Thorne said. His gravelly voice was brisk and devoid of pleasantries. "We served Lawson at his Annapolis office 2 hours ago." I gripped the edge of the mattress. Did he talk? Thorne let out a dry, humorless chuckle. We did not even have to put him in an interrogation room. The moment my agents handed him the grand jury subpoena for the shell company ledgers, he practically tripped over his own desk trying to cooperate. White-collar guys rarely have the stomach for federal prison. He flipped before his lawyer even arrived. The relief washed over me, a potent mixture of vindication and sheer anxiety. The trap was set. But the relief was instantly tempered by the realization of what came next. Flipping a witness was only the first step. We needed the proof. "What did he give you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lawson surrendered access to the firm internal servers, Thorne explained. He handed over a localized hard drive containing 3 years of encrypted email correspondence between him and your father. Our cyber guys are parsing the data right now, but Lawson already pointed us to the kill shot. Thorne paused, the line crackling faintly. "Miss Vance, your father is not just arrogant. He is reckless. He documented the entire scheme in plain text. We found a thread of emails dated 4 months ago. Thomas explicitly outlines the margin calls on the West Street property. Lawson expresses concern about lacking the cash to collateralize the loan. Thomas replies, and I am quoting directly from the federal exhibit here, "Do not worry about the cash. I hold the keys to my Mother Overflow Trust. I will transfer the capital to the holding company next month. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Hearing the casual, documented proof of the betrayal was sickening. He viewed her life savings as a personal slush fund to be raided whenever his business faltered. It gets worse, Thorne continued, his tone hardening. Lawson pushed back on the timeline, warning Thomas that moving that much capital would trigger an automatic paper statement to your grandmother house. He was worried she would see the withdrawal and panic. Your father replied that he had already solved that problem. He wrote, "I booked her a suite on a 3-week family cruise to Europe. By the time she gets back, the transfer will have cleared, the loan will be secured, and she will never notice the balance dip. I will just tell her there was a ticketing error at the port and keep the rest of the family out of the country so she cannot talk to anyone." The breath hitched in my throat. He did not improvise the abandonment at the terminal. It was a calculated, premeditated strategy to isolate her. He used a transatlantic vacation as a smokescreen, an expensive distraction designed to keep the entire family occupied while he drained her accounts. The sheer malice of the plan was staggering. "We have the emails," Thorne stated, confirming the finality of the situation. "We have the forged notary admission from Lawson. We have the wire fraud tied directly to the commercial loan. The United States Attorney Office just approved the target letter. The Treasury Department is initiating a hard freeze on all of his personal and commercial assets, including the shell company. By the time that cruise ship docks in Baltimore, Thomas Vance will have zero access to the financial system. He is effectively bankrupt." I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The magnitude of the victory felt surreal. I had won. I had stopped him. But the reality of the impending fallout tasted like ash. "What about my aunt?" I asked, the lingering threat still looming over me. "She is filing an emergency injunction to remove me from the house." Thorne dismissed the concern with a quick scoff. "Let her file whatever local paperwork she wants. The moment a federal asset freeze hits, her high-priced Annapolis lawyers are going to realize their client can no longer pay their retainer. They will drop that injunction so fast it will make her head spin. You are safe in that house, Miss Vance." "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling entirely inadequate for the magnitude of what he had accomplished. "Do not thank me yet," Thorne warned. "We cut the fuel lines, but the plane is still in the air. Your father is going to realize his credit cards are declining the second he tries to buy a drink on that ship. He is going to know something went catastrophically wrong. And he is going to realize you are the only one who stayed behind to figure it out. We will be waiting for him at the terminal, but the landing is going to be messy. Be ready." We will be waiting for him at the terminal, but the landing is going to be messy. Be ready. Thorne ended the call. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, the silence of the guest bedroom wrapping around me. The administrative war was over. The federal machine was in motion, a relentless juggernaut that could not be stopped or reasoned with. But the human cost of the conflict was just beginning to surface. My father was currently enjoying the final days of his luxurious facade, completely unaware that his empire was already reduced to rubble. I had pulled the trigger, and now I had to brace myself for the impact when the shockwave finally reached the shore. The federal machine had been set into motion, but the immediate aftermath felt like stepping into a vacuum. The promised emergency injunction from my aunt never materialized. Agent Thorne had been correct. The moment the Treasury Department initiated the hard freeze on my father's commercial and personal accounts, the financial ripple effect paralyzed his legal threats. High-priced Annapolis defense attorneys do not work for free. When the retainer checks failed to clear, the law firm representing my aunt quietly dropped the petition. The process server never arrived. The threat of being exiled from my grandmother's house evaporated into the humid Maryland air. What followed were days 32 through 34 of the 5-week timeline. The absence of conflict was jarring. I had spent the last month operating on pure adrenaline, fighting banking regulations and navigating federal bureaucracy. Now, with the traps securely closed and the cruise ship still making its way back across the Atlantic Ocean, there was nothing left to do but wait. The stillness of the suburban neighborhood felt heavy, wrapped in an eerie tranquility that kept my nerves drawn tight. I tried to channel my lingering anxiety into physical labor. The late summer heat was oppressive, the kind of thick, stagnant humidity that makes the horizon shimmer. Despite the weather, Beatrice wanted to work in her garden. She had spent 30 years teaching history to middle school students, a career that required infinite patience and a structured routine. When her routine was shattered by the events at the port, she retreated to the familiar comfort of her backyard. We spent the early afternoon planting late-season tomatoes along the wooden fence line. I knelt in the damp soil, my knees sinking into the earth, feeling the grit pack beneath my fingernails. The smell of wet dirt and sharp green tomato vines filled the air. Beatrice worked beside me, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and gardening gloves. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, gently packing the soil around the fragile roots. We did not talk about the federal investigation. We did not discuss the target letter waiting for Thomas. We focused entirely on the immediate, tangible task of keeping the plants upright in the sweltering heat. The physical exertion provided a necessary anchor, a brief respite from the digital ledgers and forged documents that had consumed my life. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the grass, we were both exhausted and coated in sweat. The evening chorus of cicadas started to hum, a rising mechanical drone that signaled the end of the day. I went inside and took a quick shower, washing away the garden dirt. When I returned to the kitchen, Beatrice had decided to order dinner from a local seafood market down the street. It was a classic Maryland summer ritual. I brought out a stack of old Capital Gazette newspapers and spread the crinkling pages over the wooden picnic table on the back patio. I set out the wooden mallets, small paring knives, and a roll of paper towels. A few minutes later, a delivery driver dropped off a heavy, steaming brown paper bag. I carried it to the backyard and poured the contents onto the center of the newspaper. A dozen large, steamed blue crabs tumbled out, coated in a thick, dark red layer of peppery seasoning. The sharp, briny scent of the Chesapeake Bay mingled with the evening humidity. We sat across from each other at the picnic table. The process of picking steamed crabs is inherently slow and meticulous. It requires focus. You have to crack the hard shells, navigate the intricate cartilage, and extract the meat piece by piece. The spicy seasoning stings the small cuts on your fingers. It is a meal that forces you to sit still and be present. I cracked a claw with my wooden mallet, the sharp snap echoing in the quiet yard. I pulled the meat free and dipped it in a small cup of apple cider vinegar. Beatrice was working on a crab shell, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The warm breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree above us. For a long time, the only sounds were the breaking of shells and the hum of the insects. Then Beatrice set her mallet down on the newspaper. She wiped her hands on a paper towel, staining the white paper with red spice. She looked out at the newly planted tomato vines, her expression unreadable in the fading twilight. I spent the last 2 days thinking about 2008, Beatrice said. Her voice was quiet, blending into the ambient noise of the yard. I stopped picking my crab. I looked at her, unsure of where the conversation was heading. I remembered how fiercely she had defended him just a week ago, using that specific financial crisis as the ultimate justification for his crimes. He was so proud of himself back then, she continued, her gaze fixed on the fence. When the housing market collapsed and your uncle lost his job, Thomas swooped in. He wrote the checks. He paid the mortgages. He acted like a general, leading his troops through a war. I always thought he did it out of a deep, unconditional love for this family. I thought he was sacrificing his own comfort to keep us safe. She picked up her glass of iced tea. The condensation dripped onto the newspaper, blurring the printed words. But sitting in this house, waiting for him to come back, I realized something ugly, Amelia. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes held a profound, devastating clarity. He did not bail your uncle out because he loved him. He did it because he loved being the savior. He loved the way we all looked at him when he walked into a room. He loved holding the strings. The observation was sharp and entirely accurate. My compliance training taught me to identify the motivations behind financial fraud. Desperation is a common trigger, but ego is the foundation of every major embezzlement scheme. When his commercial real estate business started to fail this year, Beatrice said, her voice steadying into a firm, undeniable truth, when his loans went bad and his investments dried up, he could not bear the thought of losing that status. He could not stand the idea of walking into Sunday dinner and admitting he was just as vulnerable as the rest of us. He needed to maintain the illusion of the wealthy, untouchable patriarch. She gestured toward the empty driveway at the front of the house. He forged my name while I was in a hospital bed. He set up dummy corporations. He used his own sister to threaten you. He handed me a $20 bill and left me standing on the concrete because dealing with me meant confronting his own failure. He did not steal my retirement to save our family. He stole it to save his reflection in the mirror. Hearing her articulate the reality of his betrayal was both validating and deeply tragic. She had finally dismantled the pedestal she had built for her eldest son. She recognized that his actions were not a misguided attempt at protection, but a calculated, predatory campaign driven by pure vanity. I did not offer empty platitudes. I did not tell her everything was going to be all right, because nothing about a federal indictment is all right. The fallout would fracture our family permanently. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was warm and stained with the peppery crab seasoning. "We will get through the landing, Graham," I told her softly. Beatrice nodded. She turned her hand over and squeezed my fingers. The quiet heartbreak from a week ago had hardened into a resilient, sorrowful acceptance. She picked up her wooden mallet and returned to the meal, her posture straight and unbroken. We finished dinner under the glow of the patio string lights. We rolled up the messy newspaper, tied the trash bags tight, and wiped the wooden table clean. The evening routine was a grounding mechanism, a way to exert control over a small corner of a world that was about to tilt wildly off its axis. I went to bed that night listening to the distant sound of the highway. Somewhere, out in the dark water of the Atlantic, a luxury cruise liner was charting its final course toward the Maryland coastline. My father was on that ship, likely experiencing the terrifying realization that his digital banking portals were locked and his credit limits were frozen. He was sailing directly into a storm he could not bribe his way out of. The eerie tranquility of the suburban night was coming to an end. The paper trail had been laid, the federal agents were briefed, and the final confrontation at the port was now merely hours away. Week 5 arrived with the heavy, unyielding heat of late Maryland summer. I woke up before dawn. The sky was still a bruised purple, and the air outside the guest bedroom window was thick with moisture. I did not bother trying to go back to sleep. The waiting was over. The transatlantic liner was scheduled to dock at the South Locust Point terminal at 7 in the morning. I showered, dressed in a sharp, professional blazer and dark slacks, and drank a cup of black coffee in the quiet kitchen. Beatrice was still asleep. I left a note on the counter, grabbed my car keys, and drove back to the very place where the nightmare had started 35 days ago. The drive up Interstate 95 was a reversal of the agonizing journey I had taken with my grandmother. The morning commuter traffic was building, but my mind was operating with cold, crystalline anticipation. I reviewed the mechanics of the trap I had built: the forged notary stamp, the shell company ledgers, the commercial real estate collateral, the grand jury subpoena executed against Kevin Lawson, the federal asset freeze. Every gear in the administrative machine was locked into place, spinning silently toward a devastating collision. I parked my Honda Civic in the sprawling concrete lot adjacent to the port terminal. The scale of the operation at the harbor is always overwhelming. Massive cargo cranes loomed in the distance, and the air tasted of salt and industrial exhaust. But my focus was entirely on the 12-story white hull of the cruise ship that had just secured its mooring lines to the concrete pier. The sheer size of the vessel was staggering, a floating luxury resort returning to the reality of the mainland. I walked toward the main arrivals building. The disembarkation process for an international cruise is highly structured. Thousands of passengers must filter through a series of enclosed gangways, retrieve their luggage from a cavernous warehouse, and pass through a final customs and border protection checkpoint before entering the public greeting area. I bypassed the anxious families holding welcome home balloons and positioned myself near the heavy glass exit doors of the customs checkpoint. I crossed my arms and waited. The first wave of passengers began to trickle through the doors around 8:30. They looked exhausted but happy, dragging rolling suitcases and adjusting their sunglasses against the morning glare. I scanned the crowd with a clinical detachment. I was looking for the linen shirts, the expensive watches, the practiced, arrogant postures that defined my extended family. Another hour passed. The flow of passengers turned into a steady, chaotic stream. Then I saw them. My family emerged from the customs checkpoint, moving like a unified, privileged phalanx. They were deeply tanned from weeks of Mediterranean sun. They carried brightly colored duty-free shopping bags and wore relaxed resort clothing. My mother, Patricia, walked near the front, her oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses pushed up onto her forehead. She was laughing at something my Aunt Susan had just said. Susan was holding a designer tote bag, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that she had attempted to use the legal system to terrorize me while she sipped cocktails off the coast of Spain. My younger sister Jessica dragged her heavy luggage behind them, complaining to a cousin about the lack of strong cellular service during the final leg of the voyage. They looked like a picture-perfect advertisement for upper-middle-class success. They were returning from a lavish European vacation, fully expecting to slide seamlessly back into their comfortable, subsidized Annapolis lives. And then, walking right behind the group, was my father. Thomas Vance looked exactly as he had on the day of departure. He wore a crisp, light blue button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His posture was straight and commanding. He pushed a brass luggage cart loaded with expensive hard-shell suitcases. He was smiling, projecting the image of the generous patriarch who had successfully treated his family to the trip of a lifetime. I watched him navigate the crowded terminal. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This man had forged his own mother's signature while she was incapacitated in a hospital bed. He had drained $155,000 from her retirement trust to prop up his failing commercial real estate firm. He had abandoned her on the curb with $20 and instructed his sister to file a fraudulent emergency injunction against me. Yet here he was, laughing and pushing a luggage cart, entirely convinced of his own invulnerability. But my compliance training trained my eyes to look past the surface. I looked closer. As Thomas pushed the cart toward the exit doors, I noticed the slight, rigid tension in his jaw. I noticed the way his grip on the brass handle was tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The federal asset freeze had been initiated days ago. His credit cards must have started declining on the ship. The luxury facade was still intact, but the foundation was already cracking. He knew something was wrong. He just did not know the magnitude of the disaster waiting for him. They walked through the sliding glass doors into the public greeting area. Patricia spotted me first. The laughter died in her throat. She stopped walking, her designer suitcase bumping against her heels. She quickly lowered her sunglasses over her eyes, an automatic defensive reflex to avoid making direct contact with reality. Susan followed her gaze. When my aunt saw me standing by the exit, her relaxed posture stiffened into immediate hostility. She likely assumed the process server had failed to deliver the emergency injunction, and she was preparing to launch a verbal assault right there in the terminal. But Thomas did not hide behind sunglasses or display outward hostility. When his eyes locked onto mine across the crowded concrete floor, he stopped pushing the luggage cart. He stood at the head of his family, the patriarch, assessing a minor obstacle. He looked me up and down, taking in my conservative blazer and my lack of a panicked expression. A slow, ugly sneer crept across his face. He thought he understood the parameters of the conflict. He believed he was dealing with a frantic, outgunned daughter holding a meaningless local civil lawsuit. He expected me to be clutching a folder of printed bank statements, demanding a tearful explanation, or begging for a financial settlement to drop the issue. He believed the battle was still being fought on his terms, within a jurisdiction he could easily manipulate through expensive lawyers and social standing. Thomas let go of the luggage cart. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, a deliberate stalling motion designed to project total control. He stepped away from his wife and sister, walking across the terminal floor directly toward me. The rest of the family stayed back, a silent audience watching the patriarch prepare to discipline a rebellious child. He closed the distance, the smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the diesel exhaust of the harbor. He stopped 2 feet away from me. He was taller, broader, and used to using his physical presence to intimidate smaller opponents in boardrooms and family gatherings. I did not step back. I maintained my ground, keeping my arms crossed and my expression completely neutral. "Amelia," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, patronizing register, "you really do not know when to quit, do you? I told you I would handle the ticketing error with your grandmother when I got back. What are you doing here? Are you trying to serve me with some pathetic local lawsuit because you missed out on a vacation?" He laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that was meant to humiliate me. He leaned in closer, dropping the facade of the generous father. "Susan told me you were digging through the attic," he murmured, his tone laced with menace. "You think you found something clever? Let me explain how this works. I pay a law firm in Annapolis $300 an hour. By noon today, you are going to be permanently barred from setting foot on my mother property. You should have taken the settlement money I offered you. Now, you get absolutely nothing. Walk away, Amelia, before I decide to ruin you." I looked at him. I absorbed the threat, the arrogance, and the sheer delusion of his worldview. He was threatening me with a local injunction that had already been abandoned by lawyers who could no longer cash his frozen checks. He was threatening to ruin me while standing in the epicenter of his own destruction. I did not shout. I did not throw the details of his forged notary stamp in his face. I did not engage in a dramatic monologue about his betrayal. I simply uncrossed my arms, took a deliberate half step to my left, and looked past his shoulder toward the heavy glass doors of the customs exit. Thomas frowned, confused by my lack of a defensive reaction. He turned his head, following my line of sight to see what I was looking at. And that is when the trap finally, irreversibly, snapped shut. Thomas turned his head to follow my gaze. The patronizing sneer on his face had not yet faded when he realized I was not standing by the customs exit alone. I had positioned myself intentionally, blocking the view of the small, unmarked security door located just to the right of the main terminal corridor. As I stepped aside, the heavy metal door pushed open. A man walked out into the bright morning light of the public greeting area. He did not wear a local police uniform. He was not carrying a clipboard of civil lawsuits. He wore a dark, tailored suit jacket over a plain white shirt, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that instantly absorbed the ambient noise of the terminal. It was Special Agent Elias Thorne. Thorne did not march. He closed the distance between the security door and my father with the steady, measured pace of a predator that knows the prey has nowhere left to run. He stopped directly beside me, invading the personal space Thomas had just tried to dominate. Thomas blinked. The arrogant certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. He looked at Thorne, trying to place the man within his mental Rolodex of local Annapolis lawyers and regional bank managers. He came up empty. "Who the hell are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice defensive but lacking its usual booming baritone. "Are you the lawyer she dragged down here? Let me save you some billable hours, buddy. I have a firm on retainer that will tie this ridiculous harassment suit up in court for the next 10 years. Thorne did not respond to the threat. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was smooth and practiced. He extracted a flat leather wallet and flipped it open. The fluorescent lights of the terminal caught the sharp glint of the gold shield pinned to the leather, situated right below his federal identification card. "I am Special Agent Elias Thorne with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the surrounding chatter of reuniting families. "Thomas Vance, you are going to need a much better law firm." The color drained from my father's face so fast it looked like a physical injury. The deep Mediterranean tan he had acquired over the last 3 weeks suddenly appeared sallow and sickly against the pale shock gripping his features. The confident, wealthy commercial real estate developer vanished. His broad shoulders slumped, the crisp lines of his linen shirt suddenly looking hollow. He stared at the gold shield, his mind struggling to process the devastating escalation of the conflict. He had prepared for a local family dispute. He had prepared for an angry daughter. He had not prepared for the federal government. "IRS," Thomas stammered, the word catching in his throat. "What is this? There is a mistake. I am a commercial developer. My business accounts are fully audited." Thorne snapped the leather wallet shut and returned it to his pocket. He did not yell. He did not reach for handcuffs. He dismantled my father with terrifying administrative precision. "Your business accounts were audited by your partner, Kevin Lawson," Thorne stated, his tone clinically detached. "Mr. Lawson surrendered full access to the Severn Edge Holdings LLC ledgers 4 days ago, pursuant to a federal grand jury subpoena. We have the encrypted emails, Mr. Vance. We have the internal communications where you explicitly directed him to apply a fraudulent notary seal to your mother revocable living trust. We have the routing numbers, proving you wired $155,000 of stolen capital across state lines to illegally collateralize a commercial loan on West Street." Thomas took a staggering step backward. His heel caught the edge of a concrete floor tile. He nearly lost his balance, his arms flailing slightly before he caught himself. He looked wildly over his shoulder toward Patricia and Susan, who were still standing by the luggage carts 50 feet away. They could not hear the conversation, but they could see the catastrophic shift in his posture. Patricia clutched her designer purse, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "You cannot use those emails," Thomas choked out, turning back to Thorne. The desperation in his voice was raw and pathetic. "That is privileged corporate communication. You need a warrant." "We had a warrant," Thorne replied smoothly. "We executed it the moment Lawson confessed. The United States Attorney Office reviewed the evidence yesterday afternoon." Thorne reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket again. He pulled out a thick, sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. He held it out, pressing it firmly against my father's chest. Thomas did not reach for it. Thorne simply let go, forcing Thomas to trap the envelope against his own sternum to keep it from falling to the concrete floor. "You have been formally designated as the primary target of an active federal investigation," Thorne declared, ensuring his voice carried the necessary legal weight. "You are facing pending indictments for wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and federal tax evasion. Furthermore, as of 0800 hours this morning, the Treasury Department has initiated a comprehensive asset freeze. All personal and commercial accounts linked to your Social Security number and corporate tax identification have been locked. Your credit lines are void. You have zero access to the financial system pending the outcome of the grand jury. Thomas stared down at the heavy envelope pinned to his chest. The realization of his total ruin settled over him. It was a suffocating, inescapable reality. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of wealth and influence. He had used that wealth to bully his family, to shield himself from consequence, and to justify his own moral bankruptcy. In less than 3 minutes, a man in a plain suit had effectively erased his entire existence. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a profound, uncomprehending terror. He finally understood the magnitude of what I had done. I did not just hire a local lawyer to fight for my grandmother money. I did not just file a civil suit in Anne Arundel County that he could bury in bureaucratic red tape. I had bypassed the local battlefield entirely. I had tracked the mechanical structure of his crimes, built an airtight compliance dossier, and handed the ignition key to the most lethal financial law enforcement agency in the country. I had triggered a federal strike that would reduce his commercial empire to ashes. "Amelia," he whispered. The word was a broken, fragile plea. It was the sound of a drowning man begging for a lifeline. "Please. You have to tell them. Tell them it was a family misunderstanding. I was going to pay her back. I was going to put the money back when the West Street deal closed. Tell them." I looked at the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle. I looked at the man who had paid for my college textbooks. And then I looked at the man who had handed his 76-year-old mother a $20 bill and left her standing on the curb. I did not feel a sudden surge of triumphant joy. I did not feel the need to deliver a dramatic, vindictive speech. The compliance officer inside my head recognized that the audit was complete. The accounts were reconciled. The emotional reservoir I had maintained for 5 weeks was completely dry. I felt nothing but a cold, heavy exhaustion and a deep, abiding pity for the pathetic figure shivering in front of me. "You should have just bought her the ticket, Thomas," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of all anger. I turned away from him. I did not look back at my mother, who was now rushing toward us with a look of absolute hysteria on her face. I did not look at my aunt, whose expensive legal threats had just been rendered entirely impotent by a federal asset freeze. I left them standing in the middle of the crowded terminal, surrounded by laughing tourists and duty-free shopping bags, facing the immediate, inescapable collapse of their subsidized reality. Agent Thorne remained with Thomas to explain the parameters of his travel restrictions and the impending arraignment schedule. I walked out of the terminal and stepped into the blinding Maryland sunlight. The humid air hit my face, smelling of salt and hot asphalt. I walked across the sprawling concrete parking lot toward my reliable, aging Honda Civic. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The heat inside the car was stifling, but I did not turn on the engine immediately. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, my hands trembling slightly as the massive wave of adrenaline finally began to recede. The administrative war was over. The federal machine had taken control of the target. But the human fallout was just beginning. And I still had to drive back to Annapolis to tell my grandmother that the son she tried to protect was going to federal prison. I drove back to Annapolis as the sky over the highway darkened with heavy, gray clouds. A sudden late summer thunderstorm broke just as I crossed the Severn River Bridge, the rain washing the harbor salt from my windshield. The rhythmic squeak of the wipers provided the only sound in the car. I had initiated the destruction of my own father, and now I had to carry the wreckage back to the woman who raised him. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. The house smelled of brewing coffee and lemon polish. Beatrice was sitting at the kitchen table reading a paperback novel. She looked up when I walked into the room. She saw my damp clothes and the exhaustion pulling at the corners of my mouth. I sat down across from her. I did not soften the blow with gentle phrasing. I told her about the federal agents at the terminal. I told her about the Target letter, the frozen accounts, and the look of sheer terror on his face when he realized his empire was gone. Beatrice did not gasp or clutch her chest. She closed her book, marking the page with a torn strip of paper. She rested her hands on the Formica counter, her knuckles pale. The tears came slowly, tracing quiet lines down her weathered cheeks. She was not crying for the arrogant real estate developer standing at the customs gate. She was mourning the ambitious little boy she had raised. Recognizing that he had been replaced by a stranger she could no longer protect. We sat together in the kitchen while the rain battered the windows, sharing a messy, imperfect grief that offered no easy resolutions. The fallout over the next few weeks tore our extended family down the middle. Real life does not wrap up neatly like a television drama. When a patriarch falls in modern American society, the surrounding dependents scatter to protect their own interests. My mother, Patricia, did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. Within a month of the asset freeze, she hired a ruthless divorce attorney to shield her luxury vehicles and jewelry from the impending federal seizures. She packed her bags and moved into a rented condominium across town, severing her ties to the sinking ship. My Aunt Susan sent me one final text message, blaming me for embarrassing the family name at her country club, and then blocked my number. The cousins and uncles splintered. Half of them refused to speak to me, claiming I should have kept the theft a private matter. The other half distanced themselves from the Vance name entirely, terrified that the IRS might audit their own finances by association. When the holidays arrived that year, the usually crowded brick house was agonizingly quiet. I sat carving a small turkey in the kitchen, listening to the ticking wall clock. I felt a sharp, unexpected sting of loss. I missed the chaotic noise of my sister complaining. I missed the chaotic energy of a dozen people crowded around the dining table. Doing the right thing had cost me my family. And there were nights when the isolation felt heavier than the justice. Meanwhile, Thomas faced the crushing reality of the federal justice system. He did not get a swift, cinematic trial. Federal financial cases are mountains of bureaucratic paperwork. Stripped of his wealth and barred from trading, he was forced to move into a cheap, month-to-month apartment in Glen Burnie. His passport was confiscated. The local commercial real estate community in Annapolis shunned him, treating his name like a contagion. He spent his days sitting in a public defender office, facing a grueling 3-year legal battle before his inevitable sentencing hearing. The arrogant titan who once threw $20 bills at his mother was now rationing his grocery budget. Securing justice for Beatrice was equally unglamorous. The federal government moves with a slow, grinding indifference. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had frozen the stolen capital, but returning it to the victim required navigating a labyrinth of red tape. Beatrice and I spent 8 months sitting at the kitchen table, filling out notarized affidavits, submitting compliance forms, and communicating with the Department of Justice Victim Advocate Office. It was a tedious, frustrating process that required infinite patience. Finally, early the next spring, a thick envelope arrived in the mail bearing the seal of the United States Treasury. Inside was a restitution check for $155,000. The money was safe. But the journey of that stolen capital was about to end with a twist that nobody in our fractured family could have ever anticipated. Because Thomas had used the embezzled trust funds to illegally collateralize his commercial mortgage, the federal government triggered a civil asset forfeiture. The United States Marshals Service seized the West Street retail block, stripping the deed from his failing development firm. Once the property was cleared of its fraudulent liens, The marshals listed the commercial building for public auction to recoup the remaining defaulted debts. Beatrice held her restitution check in her hands for 2 days. She did not deposit it back into the wealth management overflow account. Instead, on a crisp Tuesday morning, she asked me to drive her to the Federal Auction House in downtown Baltimore. We sat in a back row of a sterile municipal auditorium filled with local contractors and real estate investors. When the West Street commercial block came up on the docket, the bidding opened low, tainted by the scandal of the federal seizure. I watched my grandmother raise her numbered paddle. She used her restored trust funds, combined with a lifetime of saved teacher pensions, to place a bid. The auctioneer slammed his wooden gavel. Sold. The sheer poetic irony of the outcome left me breathless. Thomas had sacrificed his morality, his freedom, and his family to build his commercial real estate legacy. He had stolen from his own mother to keep his crown jewel. And now, through the rigid mechanics of federal forfeiture and public auction, that very same property legally belonged to Beatrice Vance. The retired middle school teacher had become the landlord of her son's greatest ambition. Beatrice did not keep the building as a monument to his ego. She had no interest in playing the role of a wealthy developer. Within a month of securing the deed, she signed a low-cost, long-term lease with an Anne Arundel County educational nonprofit. She turned the luxury retail space into a public tutoring center for underfunded school districts. She took the architecture of his greed and transformed it into a foundation for her community. I still live in Maryland. I still work as a regional compliance officer. My life is quieter now, stripped of the toxic obligations that used to dictate my weekends. I never received an apology from my mother or my sister. I will likely never speak to my father again. The healing process has been messy, filled with lingering doubts and the occasional pang of grief for the family I thought I had. But every Sunday afternoon I drive to Annapolis. I sit on the back patio with my grandmother, we drink iced tea, we watch the tomato vines grow, and we enjoy the profound, unbreakable peace of a home built on truth. I learned the hardest lesson a daughter can learn. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never require your silence. Sometimes, you have to let the structure burn to the ground so you can finally see the sky. Looking back at the humid asphalt of the Port of Baltimore, the memory feels distant now, like watching a film reel of someone else's life. I do not regret picking up that discarded floral weekender bag from the concrete. I do not regret diving into the stifling heat of my grandmother's attic to hunt for a forged notary stamp. Nor do I regret making that terrifying drive to the Federal Building in downtown Baltimore. This entire ordeal stripped away the comfortable illusions I carried about my relatives, leaving behind a few cold, undeniable truths. First, I learned that DNA is not a shield against accountability. We are often conditioned to romanticize unconditional family loyalty, expecting the younger generation to absorb the collateral damage of their parents' financial mistakes. But loyalty should never require your ruin or your silence. If someone uses your shared last name as leverage to steal your security, they have already broken the family contract. You owe them nothing. Second, I learned the devastating power of a paper trail. Righteous anger and screaming matches in a bank lobby accomplish nothing but your own public humiliation. Real power is quiet. It is administrative. It lives in the routing numbers, the property deeds, and the municipal tax filings. Financial predators thrive on emotional chaos. They suffocate under the weight of organized, undeniable data. Finally, I learned that justice does not automatically yield a cheerful resolution. Holding my father accountable fractured my extended family permanently. You do not get to amputate a diseased dynamic and walk away without a limp. The healing process is deeply imperfect. Sometimes the only prize you win is the quiet safety of a living room where no one is lying to you. I will take that quiet peace over a crowded, subsidized fiction every single time. I share this narrative because intra-family exploitation thrives in the dark, relying heavily on the victim's shame to remain hidden. If you are sensing familiar red flags in your own home, trust your instincts. Follow the wires. Thank you for walking through this journey with me today on Maya Tells Stories. If my fight to protect Beatrice resonated with you, or if you found value in these hard-earned lessons, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your subscriptions, likes, and shares are the essential foundation that allows this platform to exist. They help maintain and further develop the channel so we can continue bringing you more captivating, grounded stories about the incredible resilience of ordinary people fighting back against the odds. Hit the notification bell, drop a comment, sharing your own thoughts on setting boundaries with toxic relatives, and remember, no one has the right to forge your future. I will see you in the next video.